You're listening to the Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinner. The British government has given the green light to over £12.3 billion of arms sales to countries that it condemns for human rights abuses. A report by Parliament's Committee on Arms Export Controls found that over 3,000 export licences were granted for military and intelligence equipment to countries like Iran, Sri Lanka, Belarus and Zimbabwe. They're all countries on the government's official list for human rights abuses. The chairman of the Arms Export Committee, Sir John Stanley, says there's an inherent conflict between strongly promoting arms exports to authoritarian regimes while strongly criticising their lack of human rights at the same time. So, should the British government sell military equipment and technology to countries that it suspects of human rights abuses? Or will other countries just fill the gap if British defence firms stop selling arms to these countries? Well, joining me for today's discussion is Andrew Feinstein, author of The Shadow World Inside the Global Arms Trade. He also gave evidence to Parliament's Committee on Arms Export Controls. Anthony Hall is editor of the Defence Management Journal. David Coburn is the chairman of the London branch of the United Kingdom Independence Party. And Dr. John Louth is the director for Defence, Industries and Society at the Royal United Services Institute. Well, we'll start with Anthony Hall from Defence Management Journal. Should Britain be selling arms to countries that it suspects of human rights abuses?
It's the British government's role to licence and control that trade where their responsibility comes in. The companies operate within the law, within bounds, but you do have to remember that it's they're in the business to sell and export. And that's where I think the controls on that really need to come in.
David Coburn from UKIP.
I think we need to sell arms to subsidise our armed forces, and if we're not in that sort of business, I'm afraid we will not have a first-class army, air force and navy. Obviously, it's not desirable to sell them to the wrong sort of people. I mean, I can't understand why the Prime Minister seems so keen to sell stuff to Syria, and especially to an unstable bunch of people who may end up using them against ourselves. I think it should only be sold to stable regimes. I don't believe everywhere in the world is like Surrey. The world is not as we would like it and love it to be, but there are a lot of British jobs rely on the arms business, and I'm afraid we have to be realistic. If we don't sell them, the French will. The French most certainly will. They're absolutely got zero decency in this regard. So, we sell them or somebody else does.
Dr. Louth from RUSI.
Well, I'm rather pleased that the world isn't like Surrey. But I think the important thing to note is that this is a difficult, complicated business. And I think it's right to stress that government's role is to regulate a complicated, difficult, and in many ways lethal business. So the fact that licenses are being, on the face of it, approved is, one could argue, a good thing, that there is a process that's allowing things to be regulated and monitored. I think where the complexity comes in is how that process can be attacked, if you like, by people who know how to manipulate the process at its core. And I think that's where some of the issues are. The corruption within the process and within some of the businesses and practices is the important point.
Andrew Feinstein, author and an expert on the arms trade.
There's no doubt that there is a need for a regulated and stable trade in weapons. We live in an unstable world. I certainly do not suggest that there shouldn't be an arms trade. However, the reality at the moment, as I reflect in the book, is that even the laws, regulations and procedures that do exist in Western countries, in Russia and America, which buys and sells almost as much as the rest of the world combined, these laws, regulations, be they national, multilateral, are constantly contravened and undermined. And so what I would like to see is a trade in arms that is actually regulated. I think that a lot of the laws and regulations exist and are adequate, but it is their application that is dreadfully lacking at the moment.
We heard from the Foreign Secretary William Hague only a week ago who said we have these practices in place. We've got this report from the committee, the parliamentary committee, that has outlined all of these regulations. Dr. Louth from RUSI, do you think that the regulations there aren't effective enough, as Andrew Feinstein said?
There are 2 points. The first point that I usually make is that the regulatory regimes are national regimes and they differ between states. The second point is that people who are both buying and selling not just weapons but services, a whole range of activities, are wily operators. They know how to generate an advantage commercially. And if they can bend those regulations to their advantage and to meet their ambition, then they will do that. I think one of the interesting points that is frequently made and is made again by the committee is that this should be much more internationalised, but that brings a whole range of different issues.
I think the committee actually pointed out some serious flaws, as you said, about where there was gaps, loopholes. A couple of things off the top of my head. It was talking about these companies are global, their subsidiaries re-exporting goods. Also, they made a point about defence and security now is international. They're being deployed internationally. So they're talking about private security operating in the Gulf against counter-piracy. You're sending, they're buying weapons, defence equipment. Now, these are international bodies. So who controls what they do?
Andrew Feinstein, I'm going to bring you in here. We heard there are regulations in place, but in your book, The Shadow World Inside the Global Arms Trade, you mention about the licensing process, and indeed one of the videos that you did ahead of the release of your book, you mention about how easy it is for some people to get hold of arms that are redundant, 30 years old, and sell them on. What are we playing with here? What is this export license like? How easy is it to get hold of a license?
Let me tell you candidly that in the 13 years I've been investigating the arms trade, and I started doing this as a member of parliament in South Africa, when South Africa decided to buy $10 billion worth of weapons that the country didn't need, that are barely used today, in which well over $300 million of bribes were paid by some of the leading European arms manufacturers, breaking their own laws and regulations, breaking the EU common position on arms exports, without as much as a wink. In those 13 years, I've clearly not investigated every arms deal that has been done, but those that I've investigated closely, I have yet to find one that does not break some law or regulation. So I believe that this is an extremely serious problem, and I think that the ease of accessing weaponry is as a consequence. Of course, as Anthony mentioned, regulation can constantly be improved, and therefore this report should be welcome because that's what it's trying to do. For me, the key sticking point, because most of these companies in a lot of their big ticket transactions, their billion-dollar transactions, are actually selling on behalf of their governments. There is a need for political will to meaningfully implement the regulations and the laws that exist. Because let's not forget that politicians are often at the forefront of actually selling the weaponry on behalf of their national countries. Anthony raises a very important problem. The key problems in illegality in arms deals comes from the use of intermediaries, sometimes called arms agents, arms brokers, and there is no transparency about their use, what they're paid, and what they're being paid for. It would be quite easy to control that. But at the moment you have a problem where the companies operate globally, the intermediaries operate globally, and a lot of the rules and regulations are drawn up nationally, are applied nationally. So when one takes the problem and the solution to the problem, there is a massive gap and a very unfair advantage to those who are trying to ensure that wherever there is a conflict, it is extremely easy to get weaponry.
David Coburn, do you think there is a political will within Britain? Do you think we will be able to better regulate and stop these loopholes and stop these agents, knowing the market so well that they can take advantage of it?
Well, we seem to spend so much time nowadays. The Foreign Office and the British government used to be very wise in these matters, but we seem to have handed all this stuff over to the European Union. There seems to be but Cathy Ashton, who's not exactly the most brilliant person in the world. She's, our sort of international foreign secretary. I think this would be better handled by the British government and not handled by, say, for example, the EU, where I think Andrew Feinstein's moving towards something like the EU or something. Are we talking about that?
No, not at all. I just believe that there should be international regulation as well as national regulation, and I would disagree with your point.
I don't think it would ever come about because no one is going to go for that because they all want to sell their arms.
Well, they just have at the UN an arms trade treaty has been agreed. Whether it can be implemented is another matter, but I just want to make one point. It is not Ms. Ashton you need to worry about, but the biggest salesperson for British weaponry tends to be the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom. And that's where the problem starts. The multilateral dimension of it is an added problem upon that. But if we were prepared to at least make the efforts to clean up our own arms trades nationally, we would deal with a part of the problem. Then we would have to look at the international
there's too many
dimension.
jobs
It's not,
running
it's
in
not,
that.
it's not a matter of handing over the powers. The reality is we do our own selling quite well enough at the moment.
Andrew, there are 2 points I'd like to raise with that. Just last week, the President Barroso, EU, there's been a new communication on defence exports, and the EU is now firmly behind defence exports as a way to promote growth in Europe. That is on record saying that this is what we're going to push that. The committee actually pointed out that it was they recognise it as a problem about scrutiny in the trade, because now we have to operate within EU export rules, and the EU are now saying we're pushing defence exports. The other thing is the fact, you're absolutely right by saying, we are pushing it. It's defence industry is 300,000 people. BIS, the Department of Business, Innovation and Skills, are actually now promoting this through their UKTI DSO organisation.
Obviously, the trade and industry body of the government.
Yes, it is. And they've actually stated that there's a report last within a couple of weeks ago saying, we're exporting over 8 billion last year, a rise of 62%, and they want more. This is what they're going for, and it's a stated policy.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinnott. Joining me for today's discussion is Andrew Feinstein, author of a book on the global arms trade. Anthony Hall is from Defence Management Journal. David Coburn is from UKIP. And Dr. John Louth is from the defence think tank RUSI.
I think it always find it very interesting that one of the levers that a politician can pull when he or she is operating in the international sphere is defence sales. And it's a very important aspect of government life and influence internationally, that you bend a state's will to your own by providing them with equipment that they really desire. And that has been ongoing for centuries. So we shouldn't necessarily be surprised when Cameron and others continue within that tradition. Where I think it's really important, though, is that the difference today is these sorts of deals last 40, 50, 60 years. When you have main aircraft packages, for example, that they're invariably sold with a training package, a service, a maintenance package, an upgrade package. It could be 40 or 50 years. That is a remarkably influential relationship by anyone's standards. But of course, we don't necessarily know where the states are going to be in 10, 15, 20, 30 years' time. So we have to be very realistic that these are not linear causal relationships. These are complicated relationships, and they're just one lever to try and bend a state's will to your own.
And we must have we need to retain the right for the British government to use that as a lever to maintain power in the world.
But should we also be using that to control or exert influence on countries where we've got concerns with their human rights abuses? Do you think we can have power with that to still sell the arms, but say, look, we're only going to sell you certain equipment until you meet certain regulations?
I think if you do that, you'll lose your trade. No one's going to do it. If we did that, the Russians would go in and sell them stuff, and if the Russians didn't do it, the French would. They've got no principles about these matters. I think you have to be realistic about it. That's not going to happen.
Andrew
I
Feinstein?
find that a fallacious argument. To say that drug dealers have no morals is not a reason to try and stop them selling drugs to people they're killing. We're talking about weapons here. We regulate things that affect us. We regulate the pharmaceutical industry. We regulate the alcohol and the tobacco industries. We're talking about weapons here that kill people. Surely, if we want to trade in weapons, which we clearly do, then we need to regulate them given the consequences of using them. And I just want to respond to a couple of other things as well. With respect to the EU, there has recently been a review of the EU's export laws. I went and gave evidence to a committee called COARM in Brussels. David, don't throw anything at me. Nothing in the regulations has changed as we sit here and speak, decides please to change things. But more important than that, when I go to European countries, including Britain, and I talk to those people who are supposed to be regulating the arms exports from their own countries, and I point out to them where their own laws and the EU common position have been violated, the usual response is, oh, well, that's too complicated to implement, so we often ignore it. That's the first thing. And there are literally hundreds of examples in my book of that and of the consequences of the ignoring of the laws and regulations that exist. The second thing is, I think we've got to be careful with statistics about employment in the trade, because one finds statistics from the industry, one finds statistics from people opposed to the industry, and I think we've got to try and make those as accurate as possible. So, for instance, BAE Systems, when they wanted an investigation into perhaps the most corrupt commercial transaction in history to be closed down when the Serious Fraud Office was investigating £6 billion of bribes paid to Saudi Arabia on an arms deal in the 80s, they claimed that 55,000 people's jobs were at stake if the investigation continued. It turned out the contract they were talking about with Saudi Arabia employed maybe 7,500 to 10,000 people, and a lot of those were not even in the United Kingdom. So we've got to be careful about statistics. But the final point, those were direct and indirect. The second point I want to make is that if we are at all concerned about the stability of the broader world in which we live in, and those of us who remember 7/7 and 9/11 would surely be committed to such stability, then we've got to be extremely cautious about where we are selling weaponry to. For instance, in the Parliamentary Committee's report, the United Kingdom has sold almost £3 million of defence equipment to Zimbabwe, which is run by President Robert Mugabe, who is keeping himself in power against the will of the majority of people, not that that will come out in the election that's about to take place there, because of the sort of weaponry that's being sold to him. So I don't buy the argument that if we don't sell Mugabe weaponry, somebody else will. Because if we have any standards and principles and any vision of a world that we would like to see as the United Kingdom, should not be selling weaponry to keep despots, human rights abusers like Robert Mugabe in power. Because that's what we're doing at the moment.
David Coburn from
You're
UKIP.
talking about some sort of neo-colonialism, is that what you're trying to suggest?
I'm not talking about a neo-colonialism at all. I am a South African. Okay, I believe that South Africa has the right to decide what it wants to spend its money on. As an elected representative of the ANC in South Africa, I opposed spending $10 billion on weaponry on the basis that we didn't need the weaponry. We bought 26 jet fighters. 12 of them have never left the ground. Why? Because we can't afford even to assemble them, let alone to provide the fuel to fly them, let alone to train the pilots to fly them, and we have no enemy. Okay? So as a South African parliamentarian, I opposed that. What I am saying is that each country has the right to decide what it wants to buy and sell, just as the United Kingdom does. And if the United Kingdom wants to be known to be the weapons supplier to Robert Mugabe, that is something that I, as a permanent resident in the United Kingdom, have great difficulty with.
The British government's objective is to make money for the country and keep people in employment.
So we're prepared to make the world a battlefield as a consequence of that.
Well, I'm sorry, if your country is unable to organise itself properly and feels it needs to buy all this weaponry, who are we to say no? They wanted independence, they got it. They made an absolute mess of South Africa.
Yeah, but then don't complain when a British citizen gets killed in Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwe because he's probably being killed by weapons you sold him.
He might have been killed by some Belgian rifle that had been given to them years ago, or some Kalashnikov.
It comes back to the drug dealers. So now we're all drug dealers. Let's sell to anybody.
The Russians will sell them guns.
What about the point that Andrew made about being a beacon unto the rest of the world to show them what's right? Let's show them how to regulate this industry to make it better. Why should we join everybody else?
Because it will be a very poor beacon and no one will pay the least bit of attention.
The United States has the best regulation of the arms trade in the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act.
Excuse
me, just let me finish, David. Let me finish. The United States doesn't allow its weapons manufacturers to engage in corruption. And when they do, they land up getting debarred, okay? Despite that regulation, which to a large extent they actually enforce, they sell more weapons than the rest of the world combined. So that statistic alone completely undermines your argument.
Sold by the Pentagon,
I think you could actually argue that the reason why they can be so strict about exporting is because their domestic trade is so vast.
Of course,
you're talking about a domestic defence budget in trillions of dollars. So
sure, but if they want to grow their employment, of course they want to export to bring down the cost of their weapons projects. On all their big domestic weapons projects, there has to be an export market for them. The reality with the American equipment is that it's technology that people want, that is technology of first choice, both because of the technology that is in the equipment, but also because of what happens afterwards in terms of the service and the geopolitics of it. I mean, we need to be reasonable. I'm simply arguing that this notion that you can behave like a scoundrel and not take responsibility for the state of the world just doesn't gel for me.
Can I just bring in the
real world?
Sure.
Let's bring in John Louth. We haven't heard him for a while.
I think it's a powerful argument, and it's a very moving argument, actually, and it's an argument made by somebody who's been a representative, who does live in the real world. I think the interesting point for me, of course, is that the argument just echoes my basic point that this is a very, very complicated business. It's a commercial business and it's a governmental business. Government traditionally uses arms sales to garner influence. The Americans have been absolutely fantastic at doing that for the past century or so. Many people in Europe would argue, actually, that the UK regulatory framework is a very strong framework. I think the fact that we have independent reports that critique it adds to that sense that it's a strong framework, but it can be improved. The difficulty, unfortunately, is this is never going to be an internationally regulated business, because that would bring a whole range of problems that we need more than this program to discuss. So we're left with the not perfect world that it's a national endeavor, that the focus has to be on the national regimes, but we have to recognize as well that there's a commercial reality here that drives these practices.
But should it go as far as what David Coburn was saying, that someone else will fill the void?
Well, David's argument, in a way, is not the 21st century argument. David's argument, perhaps, is it's just an economic free-for-all and the strongest will win. That's not where we are today. This is a regulated trade, warts and all. It has flaws in it, and there's a tremendous corruption associated with it. But even when that corruption is identified, I don't necessarily buy the argument that it's just brushed under the carpet. The Wolf report, etc., with BAE Systems was a very strong report. BAE Systems now, is more open than it's been before. It can be more open, of course, but I think it's more open than it's been for a number of years, simply because it's responding to the pressure that the visibility of a regime of licensing offers.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinnott. Joining me for today's discussion is Andrew Feinstein, author of a book on the global arms trade. Anthony Hall is from Defence Management Journal. David Coburn is from UKIP. And Dr. John Louth is from the defence think tank RUSI. Andrew Feinstein, do you think this report does show there is an openness towards it?
I think that this report from Parliament is a vast improvement. I think of all the reports over the years that committees in Parliament have done, this is perhaps one of the better ones in both what it reveals and what it recommends. We now need to see the extent to which this report is taken up, because unfortunately, unlike John, I wish I could say the same thing as John, that I have seen the significant improvement. The Wolf report that was commissioned by BAE Systems, in which they paid Lord Wolf £6,000 a day to chair a commission that wasn't allowed to look at the historical nature of their behaviour, including a £6 billion commissions that were paid to various middlemen and Saudi royals. Unfortunately, until there is greater transparency, we don't know what is going on now. We only find out a couple of years hence. And there is a case before the Serious Fraud Office at the moment. They're trying desperately to sweep under the carpet a £2 billion arms deal between the United Kingdom and Saudi Arabia, in which when a former lieutenant colonel in the British Army called Ian Foxley, who was the project manager on this, arrived in Riyadh to take over the project, he discovered that the Saudis weren't actually interested in delivery of the project. All they were interested in were the commissions arising from it. And huge amounts of that £2 billion, with the knowledge of the British Ministry of Defence, were going through the Cayman Islands and through Panama to various Saudi royals or people close to them. This is a current case that we can't get investigated now as we speak. This is a problem that exists now. The PR is great, and the Wolf report was a superb PR job for BAE Systems. But in terms of actually making a difference on the ground, if we want a world that is more stable, that has less conflict, less terrorism, then we have a responsibility to regulate this trade far better. There was, and I
think much more dangerous than that is Mr. Cameron saying he wants to hand weapons over to the Syrian rebels. That's much more worrying, because those weapons could well be used against us here in London. I mean, I'm
makes a good
less
point.
worried about multi-million-pound Saudi arms deals than I am about Mr. Cameron handing a load of guns and rockets and goodness knows all what to a bunch of Syrian rebels who could be mujahideen, goodness knows what they are. And I think if when you start talking about this, everyone knows fine well that all international deals, there's a massive amount of corruption in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, and everywhere else, and you do not get deals without that level of corruption. That is the real world. I'm a businessman. I know what it's like when I'm trying to do business abroad. Everybody does. So you're talking about some ideal world that doesn't exist.
So then the fact that the corruption emanates from London and Berlin and Washington is fine, is what you're saying, effectively. We're happy to be
Britain in the
corrupt.
real world is unable to simply
As a British taxpayer, I do not want my tax pounds being used in effectively subsidizing an industry that is paying massive bribes to people who have more than enough money than they could ever use in one life.
What will happen is you end up having to pay more taxes because the industry created
That's
keeps your
a
taxes
completely
down.
fallacious economic argument.
Well, you're not
Anthony,
arguing
let's bring it
capitalism.
Isn't it the case that you're now? It's what you're addressing is the corruption in business. And the habit of politicians to reach for the arms as soon as they want something actually done, because it's the lowest common denominator. You wave arms at people, and it's immediately going to get their attention. Very much like South Africa and those aircraft in bits. I think you ought to start looking beyond that, and as far as actual kind of the export trade of arms is concerned, towards security. Big area of growth which has been recognised is the security area. Now, in that case, you're not talking about tanks, not talking about planes, high-end billion dollar deals. You're talking about the equipment used to suppress people. Now that opens up an entirely different argument about what you're going to sell. What is an arm? What are arms? If you sell a protected vehicle to Egypt, let's go through the list: Egypt, Brazil, Turkey. In the next few months, I think you ought to bring up the DSEI show coming in London very, very shortly. Is that going to be controlled with a license? It's not an arm. It's not an arm. It's just a protected vehicle. So you need to look at that carefully.
What would you want for this more stable, less conflict world that Andrew mentioned? Do we need stricter controls? Do we need tighter regulation?
Yeah, yes, you do. I mean, there are movements in there. I mean, the committee's report is one. No one's actually mentioned the UN Arms Trade Treaty, and they brought up the point that the trade in water, bottled water, is more controlled than arms. It's gone through, and the correct number of people have signed it. Only, as far as I'm aware, only one country, Iceland, has actually ratified it yet. And without 50 or so people country ratifying it, it's not going anywhere.
And the other problem is the Arms Trade Treaty, which is a very good step forward, has no enforcement mechanisms. So even when it's been ratified, there is nothing that compels that national government to enact laws that meet the criteria of the ATT, which in and of itself were fairly weak criteria.
Why don't you get your own national government in South Africa to stop being so corrupt and buying these weapons? I mean, that you seem to be coming at it the wrong end of the thing.
I spend probably about 70% of my working time. I run an organisation called Corruption Watch. I spend about 70% of my time trying to do exactly that.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time for today's discussion. Thank you to all of my guests: Andrew Feinstein, author of The Shadow World: Inside the Global Arms Trade; Anthony Hall is from Defence Management Journal; David Coburn is from UKIP; and Dr. John Louth is from the defence think tank RUSI.